Dante Certification Level 3, 2nd Edition. Dante in a Layer 3 environment. So far, we've learned a lot about Layer 2 versus Layer 3 networks, segmenting the broadcast domain, assigning unique subnets to each VLAN, and then linking them together with a router. With that knowledge under our belt, we can quickly delve into the challenges that a Layer 3 network imposes and how a Dante audio-video network overcomes those challenges. Let's suppose we have two VLANs, each with a few Dante devices in them. And of course, we connect these with a router. When we launch Dante Controller, it attempts to discover the devices by subscribing to a multicast stream. But wait, a multicast stream only works within a VLAN, right? Multicast doesn't cross a router, so Dante Controller won't discover devices in other subnets. Likewise, when we establish a clock leader, we'll only establish sync with devices within our subnet. PTP clocking also uses multicast. Now, when it comes to our media streams, we know that those can be sent by unicast or multicast. It's our choice. So as long as we can overcome the challenges of discovery and clocking, we'll be able to work in a Layer 3 space just fine. And indeed, Dante has the solution. We can use Dante Domain Manager. In our Level 2 certification, we suggested that many people get confused when trying to understand Dante Domain Manager. They try to picture it as a singular tool, but it isn't. Dante Domain Manager is more like a toolbox full of different functions. The various tools do have a common thread. They require a central server. Unlike Dante devices that can come and go on the network at will, Dante Domain Manager is a permanent asset on the network. It's a central meetup point for all of the devices, a repository for databases, a processor for more complex coordination tasks, a storage place for system logs, and much more. Now, before we show you how to use Dante Domain Manager, first we need to explain what a domain is. The concept of a domain is very similar to folders on your computer. I could certainly have a mess of files on the desktop of my computer, but as my system grows, it helps to organize these into folders. Maybe I could organize these as productivity documents, pictures, and music files. Now, when I'm looking for a white paper I wrote, I can look in my documents. When I want to teach my son about classic paintings, I can look in my pictures folder. With this sort of organization, I'll be able to locate and identify my files much faster. Well, I can do the same thing with my Dante devices. I can organize devices into domains, groups of devices I want to see together. In our example, we'll create an auditorium, a background music and paging system, and a collection of meeting spaces. As the system scales up, this helps prevent out-of-control device lists like this, or like this. Yes, these are screenshots from installations before we had Dante Domain Manager, and there were others that were even larger than these. I mean, it works, but using domains, we can come back to the list of devices we care about. When I'm working in the auditorium, I will only see the devices in that functional system. When I'm working in meeting spaces, I only view the devices in that area. This is much more manageable. Now, if we take everything and push it into one routing grid, and I make a patch from the auditorium to the meeting spaces, chances are that was an accident. So putting things into domains not only cleans up your views, but it also prevents honest mistakes. Now, we can imagine times where we'd want to be able to make subscriptions across domains. Maybe there's a presentation going on in the auditorium, and we want to be able to feed that content to an overflow space in a multi-purpose room or something like that. With Dante Domain Manager, that's possible too. So our first step is to create some domains. I'll log into Dante Domain Manager. Once in, we'll see we have our navigation tabs to the left. I'll click on the Domains tab. We can see I've already created the 3 domains I want: Auditorium, BGM, or background music, and meeting spaces. Adding and removing domains is really easy. If I click Add Domain at the bottom, I can create a new domain. We'll call this Company Picnic Event. I click Enter and we see this show up. Seriously, it's just like creating a folder on a computer. Now, when that picnic event is over, I might want to remove the domain. Okay, with the domain highlighted, I can click Delete Domain. I get a confirmation dialog, so I click OK, and just like that, the domain goes away. So with our domains created, the next thing to do is start recognizing devices that we want to be managed. Dante Domain Manager acts as a central check-in point for all Dante devices. We use unicast for this link because Dante Domain Manager will speak to each device individually. Of course, with the unicast link, this means we aren't limited to devices in our subnet. We can also have connections from devices in other subnets across the routers. As we already know, Dante Controller can log into the server as well, and now it can link to all the Dante devices through Dante Domain Manager. This makes it very easy to control your system across a property, across the country, or around the world. Dante devices remember how to contact Dante Domain Manager, so they will restore themselves even after a power cycle. And it's helpful to know that media streams do not go through the server. They continue to go directly from one Dante device to another. So you don't have to worry about overwhelming the server, even in larger deployments. To start enrolling Dante devices in domains, let's go to the Devices tab. For devices that are in the same subnet as Dante Domain Manager, this is really easy because it will automatically see their discovery messages. They will be listed here in the Unmanaged tab, and here we can see what subnet they're in. We can see they're in the same subnet as the server, and indeed they're in the same subnet as my computer right now. Once Dante Domain Manager recognizes devices, we can simply select the devices we want and drop them into the appropriate domain. Dante Domain Manager will automatically send all the appropriate instructions to make this happen for you. Now, Dante Controller may still show these devices for a bit. It gives them a bit of time before it confirms they're gone. You can hit the refresh button to force an update. With the Dante devices enrolled in Dante Domain Manager, you'll remember there's a layer of authentication now. You won't be able to see these devices until you enter your credentials. I see the right address for my server here, so I'll just enter my username and password. Once I'm in, I look at the auditorium domain from the pull-down menu. Here we see my devices. Since Dante Domain Manager allows us to span a layer 3 space, in our device lists, it will show the subnets that these devices belong to. And you know what? Here I see an amplifier for the lobby. I didn't really want this to be part of the auditorium. I wanted this to be fed by the background music system. Okay, no problem. Just like before, I can drag that device out of the auditorium domain into the BGM domain. In Dante Controller, I can see the device drop out of the auditorium domain instantly. And if I look in my BGM domain, I'll see that amp successfully moved over. So at this point, we've established the devices that are in our subnet. So now let's start getting the devices that are outside our subnet. We know that in a layer 2 space, automatic discovery uses MDNS. The little m stands for multicast, which doesn't cross a router. Now, if you only have a handful of devices, it might be easiest just to manually enroll these devices. If you have a larger deployment and wish to automate discovery, then it's helpful to know that we can use DNS-SD to bridge this together. Here's an example. We can see the server is in the 192.168.1 subnet, and it's discovering devices in 10.11.10 and the 192.168.2 subnets. Now, DNS-SD is an external service that Dante Domain Manager will use. But if you don't have it on your network already, that doesn't mean that you need another piece of hardware. You might be able to set up Dante Domain Manager and a DNS server on the same PC hardware. For now, I've only got a handful of devices. We'll just use manual enrollment. Now, when you're manually enrolling devices in other subnets, perhaps the easiest way to go about this is to put your laptop in the broadcast domain with the devices you want to enroll. That way, Dante Controller can automatically discover them. Once we see their IP addresses in Dante Controller, we can transcribe their IP addresses into Dante Domain Manager. Once Dante Domain Manager has the IP addresses, it will be like a shepherd calling his sheep, speaking to each device individually. The Dante devices will then know how to contact Dante Domain Manager, and it will establish the unicast links. And again, the Dante devices are going to remember how to contact Dante Domain Manager even if you reboot them, if you change their IP address, if you move them into a different VLAN or a different subnet. It doesn't matter. So long as Dante Domain Manager is still contacted the same way, you're good. So let's go ahead through the process of manually enrolling devices into Dante Domain Manager. In the command line, if I enter ipconfig again, you'll see I'm in a new subnet. I've moved my computer to a different VLAN that has the next batch of Dante devices I want to enroll. Dante Controller isn't logged into Dante Domain Manager. We're just discovering these on the local network again. And we can see Dante Domain Manager cannot find these using MDNS. So we'll enroll these manually. To manually enroll devices, I can either click Enroll Devices at the bottom of this page, or I can go to a Domains page and click Enroll Devices. Either way, it's the same thing. When I enroll devices into the system, I have to tell it which domain we want to target. I can choose the domain here. Of course, these devices are for the meeting spaces, so I'll leave that as my selected domain. I'll click Enroll by IP address. I can copy the addresses right out of Dante Controller. In this example, I have multiple devices, so we'll put each one on its own line. I'll fast forward through the rest of these. Instead of entering everything manually, if we had a file with the addresses in them, we could also import a CSV file or copy and paste the addresses into the field above. However we have the information entered, we can hit Enroll Devices and acknowledge the confirmation screen. Now this is where Dante Domain Manager reaches out to each device and invites them in. Now this process might take a minute, but when it's done, we're all set. Now I'll do this process again for the devices in my background music and paging system. In the command line, you can see I'm in another subnet, in another VLAN with these devices. I can enroll these two devices in Dante Domain Manager, assigning them to my BGM domain. So at this point, we have all of our devices enrolled in Dante Domain Manager. If you have the proper credentials, you can use any copy of Dante Controller, log into Dante Domain Manager, and you'll be able to see all of your devices in all of your domains and all of your subnets. You'll be able to make subscriptions, change device names or channel names, whatever you want. It's going to work just like the Dante Controller you know and love. So with discovery taken care of, the next challenge is to get clocking established. Now, it's worth noting that if you don't want your domains to clock together, you don't have to, right? If you just want them to be separate systems that you have a central management system for, that's fine. The only time you need to clock things is if you want to be able to share audio and video streams between your domains. Now in our case, we do want to do that, so let's walk you through the process. As we know, we currently have devices in different subnets. Clocking works within the subnet, but not beyond because clocking uses multicast, which does not cross the router. Once we add Dante Domain Manager, we unlock more coordination capabilities, including the ability to use unicast clocking. Now we can send precision time protocol from one subnet to another. When we do this, there's always one clock that everything resolves to. We call that the primary leader. In our second subnet, we have a device that will receive clock from the primary leader and redistribute that in its subnet by multicast. We call that a boundary clock. Now, of course, we can have multiple boundary clocks out there, each in its own subnet. There's no problem with that. Now, as a first step in this process, it's probably easiest to tell Dante Domain Manager that you want to be able to share audio or video content between certain domains. That will instruct it to set up a clocking structure like this. Right now, we can see we have devices in each subnet clocking on their own. The auditorium has a clock leader. The BGM system actually has two, one in each subnet, and the meeting spaces have their own clock leader. Let's start by establishing these three domains as a shared media group. I'll call them linked domains and click Save Changes. With the group created, I can click Edit and add other members to this group. Right now, the auditorium is the only member, but I can add BGM and meeting spaces to this group. When I click Save, I can see that I have my three domains linked, but I will still need to establish what channels should be shared between them. Now we'll come back to that. I just want to get the clocking worked out first. Indeed, I can see Dante Domain Manager is telling me that I have three clock leader devices. I need to resolve this. Okay, so let's get on that. If I click Advanced Settings for a domain that is a member of this group, I'll see the devices and their clocking status down here. To understand these screens well, we'll need to understand the icons that are being used. Now, an obvious icon is the crown. That device is the clock leader, following no one. From there, we have icons that indicate whether the device is distributing clock, meaning it's a leader, or following clock from somewhere else. And in either case, we can know whether the clocking data is being transmitted as unicast or multicast. You'll remember these icons from the Level 2 class. This is what they look like in Dante Controller. A single arrow meant unicast, while a forked arrow indicated multicast. Well, you'll see something very similar in Dante Domain Manager. When a device is acting as a clock leader, we will see arrows emerging from the clock. Again, the singular arrow coming from the clock indicates that we are sending clock data by unicast, while a forked arrow coming from the clock indicates that it is sending clock data by multicast. And by the way, a device can do both at the same time. The primary leader is likely distributing clocking data as multicast within its own subnet, and distributing unicast clocking data to boundary clocks in other subnets. We'll see this when we get into Dante Domain Manager. So, if arrows emerging from the clock indicate we are transmitting clock data, arrows coming into the clock mean we are receiving clock data. And again, we have the arrows indicating the traffic type. Okay, let's get back to Dante Domain Manager and we'll establish our clocking chain. If we see green dots, that means these devices are in sync, so that's a good thing. Now down here, we can see this mixer is currently acting as the clock leader for its subnet, and it's distributing clock by multicast. Great, that's what we expect. Now I want this to be a clock leader for other subnets, so I'll turn on unicast clocking. I'll also establish the other mixer as a standby device ready to take over if the first one disappears. Indeed, we can see the unit above is now sending unicast and multicast clock, so it's ready to roll. As we scroll down to the next subnet, we'll pick some devices to act as boundary clocks. Again, I see this device has been chosen as a clock leader already. Maybe that's a good device to have as a boundary clock. I'll enable unicast clocking for this device, and as I do, I'll see it's now receiving clock by unicast, then turning around and sending clock data locally as multicast. Now, just as we did in the last subnet, I'll pick a second device to act as a backup. Oh, and the system has decided this might be a better candidate for the boundary clock role. We can see the display indicating the role is shifted. Okay, this is all good. Finally, I'll come down to my last subnet where I pick my boundary clock and we see devices syncing. Now, I want to pause for just a moment and point something out here. As we think about the organization of my domains, it does largely follow the divisions of subnets, but that's not a requirement. Now, in practice, it does work out that way sometimes. There's no reason to take my auditorium and break it up into different subnets. I'd rather keep that all in one, and then I have the power to use unicast or multicast as the situation calls for. But if we think about something like the background music and paging system, now I'm likely to have amplifiers and DSPs spread around a property. Now it's quite likely that those devices could be in different subnets. And we could still take all of those, put them in one domain, and route between them freely. And we'll be able to see that here in the example. But the point is, domains are not restricted to the divisions of subnets. However, when we think about clocking, our clocking structure is broken up by subnet. Okay? Let's suppose we have devices in a single subnet from multiple domains. Well, there's still going to be one clock leader in that subnet distributing to all of those devices. There's no problem there. Again, we'll be able to see this as we go on, but just understand that domains are not restricted to a subnet. You can freely assign any device you want, anywhere. But clocking is typically arranged by subnet. So we'll be able to see that as we move forward. Okay, so if I come to Dante Controller in the Clock Status tab, I can see how this worked out. In the auditorium, this mixer is the primary leader right now. It is the multicast leader in the subnet, and it is the leader for the linked domains. At the top of the screen, it also shows the primary clock leader status. If I go to the BGM domain, I can see here I have a boundary clock for the 192.168.3 subnet. It is a follower for the linked domains, but it is a leader in its subnet. Now the device above is actually in the 192.168.1 subnet. That's the same as the auditorium. That device is following the primary leader right in its same domain by multicast. Now pause the video here for a moment if you need to take that in. It's really great if you can understand that domains are not restricted by subnet, but clocking structure is going to be arranged by subnet. It's not constrained by domains. Here we can see the BGM domain is not constrained to the 192.168.3 subnet. The BGM domain is spanning multiple subnets. The amplifier up here is in the 192.168.1 subnet because it is located in the auditorium. Well, since it's in the same subnet as the primary leader, it can just get clock information directly from that via multicast. All right, so let's continue on to the meeting spaces. And here, again, I can see we have a boundary clock in the 192.168.2 subnet. It is a follower for the linked domains, but it is a boundary clock, a leader for the devices within its own subnet. All right, so with clocking established, let's make some subscriptions. If I look in a list view, we can see that the BGM domain spans multiple subnets. However, if I look in the routing grid, Dante controller doesn't make that distinction anymore. Anything can route anywhere. Even though this amplifier and this DSP are in different subnets, I can come in and make a subscription just as easily as I did in our first demonstration back in level 1. So making subscriptions across subnets is really easy. Dante Domain Manager is going to make this really transparent for you. As a matter of fact, if this DSP in the example that we had was set to transmit these channels as multicast, and of course we know it has to be unicast to get across the router, Dante Domain Manager would tell that DSP, hey, I need you to make a copy of this and send it as unicast to get it across the router. So all of this is going to be handled in the background for you. You don't even have to think about it. So the next thing to show you is how to share channels from one domain to the next. We've already linked domains into a shared audio group, and we've already established a clocking hierarchy. So now we just need to pick sources to share. I'll choose my mixer in the device list and scroll down to Transmit Channel Sharing. We'll see this device is currently only shown in the auditorium, but I have other options. I can share this to all domains in this shared group, and I'll have the option to only share certain outputs. The second option gives me the ability to customize this a bit further. I'll show that in a moment. In this case, I'll select all domains because the overflow feed from the auditorium should be available everywhere. When I do this, I'll see we don't have to share it with the device name from the auditorium. I can make a device name that's sensible for use in their domains. Maybe I'll just call this Auditorium Overflow. I can also select the channels I want to share. I see the mixer is outputting the overflow mix on channels 23 and 24. Again, I can customize these labels as well. In this case, I just want to narrow this down so it shows the indicators of left and right. Once I click OK, we'll see this show up in my BGM domain, and we'll notice that it shows up in green. We give it this color so that you know it's a shared source from another device. So now, if I click in Auditorium Overflow, I can see the two channels I have are labeled left and right. It's using the custom labels that I put in. In here, I see the DSP also has channels labeled where this is supposed to land, which makes this very clear. I can make this subscription across subnets, across domains, right in the DSP. We're all good here. If I go to my meeting spaces domain, because I've shared these channels to all domains, it will appear here as well. I'll scroll down where I want these channels to land, make the subscriptions, and all is well. Easy. So of course, if I look in the auditorium, I don't see that shared channel here. There's no need to share the audio to the auditorium because the original device transmitting this is already in the auditorium. Okay, so let's do this again, sharing the background music feed to the other domains. In this case, I'm going to share it from the DSP. Again, I choose to share this to all domains with selected channels. I'll call this BGM Music. If I scroll to the end, I'll see the channels I've designated. And again, I'll shorten the labels to just show left and right indicators. And just like that, we've shared that source with the other domains. Here it is in the auditorium, and we also see it appearing in the meeting spaces. Now finally, let's offer an example of sharing a source to selected domains with selected channels. If I need more customization of the channels that are shared between domains, this will be my method. You'll see I get the other domains listed individually. Now in this example, we'll imagine that some company announcements are going to be made from the conference room to employees that are in a meeting in the auditorium. Maybe there's a new product announcement. The conference room is actually at a different corporate office, so that's not like they can just walk down the hall to the auditorium. Okay, so in the auditorium, I call this share Conference Room Announcements. I click on the shared channels, and apparently I'm feeling really creative, so I choose to label these left and right again. So I can see I'm going to share these channels in the auditorium, but not to the background music system. Once I click Save Changes, this takes effect. And indeed, these channels have not shown up in the BGM domain. It wasn't shared there. But if I go to the auditorium, here they are. Now, one thing I want you to notice, as we started creating streams across a layer 3 environment, we've added a layer of security, right, with login credentials. We've organized our devices into domains, and we've even put them into a system that will tell us if devices fall offline or if there's problems with subscriptions. With all of this, we haven't had to make any changes to our network switches. And that's a big deal. In IT circles, it's a design principle nowadays to design so that you have as few exceptions as possible. Certainly, if you need exceptions when a system goes in, everybody's going to remember to put it there because the system won't work without it. But then when you make changes to the system or you take parts out, people don't necessarily remember to remove those elements, and you start to develop this legacy baggage. Not only that, but let's suppose you have fiber connections between corporate offices. Well, that fiber connection probably goes through data centers with the telco, and you have no control over that. It's nice to know that Dante with Dante Domain Manager can get your traffic across that network without a problem. So in this chapter, we have outlined the challenges that a Layer 3 network presents and how Dante Domain Manager helps us overcome that. We discussed the concept of domains and that they allow us to group our devices however we want. Domains are not bound by subnets. You can arbitrarily put any device from any location in any domain. We can synchronize our devices across different subnets by using unicast clocking. A primary leader can send sync information to boundary clocks in each subnet, and the boundary clocks can in turn synchronize the devices within their subnets. While domains offer the ability to reduce the devices we see, this doesn't stop us from making streams between groups. We'll have the opportunity to be quite selective about the streams we want to share between domains, and we'll be able to relabel them in a way that makes sense to the people in the other domain. And of course, all of this can be done without making a single change to your network infrastructure. Dante traverses the network quite transparently.